One of the most respected journalists covering the biopharma sector in the United States federal healthcare policy system, Steve Usdin is the D.C.-based editor of BioCentury. In this podcast, we're discussing the lingering impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act on Medicare, Trump's tariff, DOGE, and anything else we can think of affecting D.C. Steve, it's great to meet you finally.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's going to be fun.
You know, I've only got about 20 hours of material that I could record. I hope we don't run out of tape. Man, there's so much going on, Steve. It's crazy here.
It is crazy town right now. I wish that more of it was positive. It's a lot of it's very alarming,
even by DC standards.
Absolutely. Never seen anything like this.
So a couple days ago, you published a great article on tariffs. The conventional wisdom is that, well, pharma escaped tariffs under this first round. What do you think?
No, for two reasons. Okay, first, of course, the macroeconomic effects of tariffs affect everyone.
Right.
And if we're talking about not just pharma, but biopharma, if we're talking about the biotech industry, the effects on interest rates, the effects on the ability of companies to raise capital are immense. You know, and that overwhelms anything else, really. The second thing is that the game's not over yet. Everybody acts like whatever happened yesterday or the day before is all that's going to happen. What's most likely going to happen is that the Trump administration is going to launch an investigation, what's called a Section 232 investigation of tariffs and for the pharmaceutical sector. And the threat of pharma-specific tariffs certainly hasn't been eliminated.
So 232, what's really interesting, I spend about 60-70% of my time in Brussels. And we've been hearing for basically since December, there were already rumblings from the Trump administration that have been filtering through to a lot of the companies based in Europe that there was a lot of indigestion and consternation around the situation in Ireland in particular. Ireland has a very low tax tariff treaty in general, very low corporate tax, and their IP laws are very favorable. What are you hearing about this 232 investigation being driven specifically about Ireland?
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of consternation about Ireland, and you hit the exactly. There's two different sets of issues. There's low taxes and a highly skilled workforce that led a lot of companies to set up manufacturing in Ireland. There's a great deal of manufacturing in Ireland. But then there are also the IP policies, the so-called patent box. I think they have a different name for it.
Well, there's a Dutch sandwich, a double Dutch sandwich. There's all these things for tax efficiencies, but yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, but they call it something else. But the general idea is that multinational pharmaceutical companies can assign their IP to a subsidiary or an entity in Ireland and then get taxed at the rate that 6-point-something% rate?
Yeah, on the IP.
On the IP, rather than U.S. corporate tax rates in the United States. One of the things that's being talked about is trying to entice companies to move that IP back to the United States by incorporating something in the tax law that wouldn't make them liable for retroactively for taxes on IP if they move things back into some kind of analog to the European patent box in the United States. Personally, I don't think it really matters, where the IP is accounted for. That's not going to actually change where you manufacture anything. It doesn't make a big difference. So I think that we've got kind of two different things that are going on. There's a lot of concern about supply chain resiliency and about bolstering U.S. domestic manufacturing. And then there's separate concerns around tax policy and revenues that come from them. And I think that those two things get conflated, and they shouldn't. They're different things.
But they're getting conflated by the administration itself sometimes, because you have Levitt going around basically saying, yeah, we're going to get revenue from this. You have Stephen Moran's study from a couple months ago that basically saying, well, we can drive revenue. And, literally I heard someone from the administration on one of the Sunday morning Talking Heads shows saying, well, we can eliminate personal taxes below anybody earning $150,000 or less. So you have this language, but then you have everyone else, this quote unquote reciprocal tariff idea where it's actually just to try and as a leverage to promote trade. Where do you think Are you seeing the square getting circled or circle getting squared?
No, absolutely not. Look, if you listen to everybody in the Trump administration, you think that tariffs are going to cure male pattern baldness and erectile dysfunction. I mean, there isn't anything that tariffs can't solve according to the Trump administration.
I'm suddenly for tariffs, Steve. All right. So the question then becomes from the biopharmaceutical sector, and I had a Twitter debate with someone about a week ago about this, even before these were announced. I mean, the problem you're going to run into, particularly with something with an inelastic demand curve like a cancer drug, the fact is, if you look at how things are running right now, people are on one-year contracts with Medicare. The wholesalers are already complaining that there's no margin there. You have certain drugs where 50, 60% are manufactured by Intas in India, a lot of the injectable oncology drugs. The reality is you have no scope to actually pass those costs through. I think there's a theory that, well, the producer will eat the cost, but how do you do that if you're on a tied contract and you have no way to renegotiate or pass through? There's just no scope.
No, it isn't going to happen. And the other thing, we would have immediate shortages if they actually imposed a 25% tax or tariff on all pharmaceuticals. The margins on generic drugs, look, 9 out of 10 scripts that are filled in the United States are generics. The margins on generics are not 25%. Companies aren't going to sell these at a loss. So if they actually do that, it's going to result in immediate shortages. I personally think that they're going to do the investigation and they're going to keep the threat of tariffs, or possibly the threat of tariffs that are selectively applied on particular companies, particularly companies, large companies that don't announce manufacturing expansion in the United States, something like that. They'll keep that threat hanging over them. But I think in the biggest effects from tariffs, as I said, are really the macroeconomic effects that are going to affect the entire industry, and they're particularly hitting the biotech industry hard.
What's interesting, if you look at this from a security supply question, obviously Europe is having the same discussions as well. There's actually legislation now about security of supply coming through the European Commission. Post-COVID, I think a lot of these discussions make a heck of a lot of sense. Okay, do we really want all of this stuff being made by third parties where we have increasingly an adversarial, confrontational relationship? That may not make sense. What I think is not being discussed, or is being very disingenuous, is the avoidance of the fact that, prices will have to go up. There's no way around that. Prices will just have to go up. Doug Holtz-Eakin, the former head of the CBO, says it best. The solution for shortages is higher prices. That's the reality.
So there are a couple of things here. One is, I think if you take a big picture look at supply chain resiliency, you have to say that the United States can't go it alone. It has to be the United States plus U.S. allies, if we have any allies left. I also think that there's an enormous opportunity to develop advanced manufacturing, biomanufacturing technologies in the United States that in the long term would dramatically improve U.S. and European supply chain resiliency. The problem is that you're going to need a lot of investment to make that happen. You're going to need a functioning regulatory system to make it happen, and you're going to need an educational system that can provide the skilled workforce that's required to man biomanufacturing facilities. That's all doable if you have a kind of a rational policy environment and you're taking the long view on it. Neither of those things is true right now in the United States. We have an increasingly irrational policy environment that's fixated on very short-term outcomes.
And if you look at this from a global competitiveness standpoint, I was talking to David Meeker, who's a former CEO of Genzyme, and we were discussing the problem of headcount. He's based in Boston. And one of the issues he was having is, look, you get these kids 10 years ago, they're Chinese nationals, they're studying at MIT, they're studying at Harvard, they're very technically savvy, they get an H-1B visa, and I hire them. The problem is now what we're seeing is a lot of those highly skilled foreign nationals, one, are not coming here, or two, they're getting their degree. They don't want the H-1B visa. They're going back to India or China and doing a startup in India or China. I mean, JP Morgan this year, the the preponderance of Chinese-led IP and startups was huge, and I think it was quite shocking. Are we losing the intellectual race right now for these minds for the next level of biopharma innovation?
Absolutely, and we're at risk of making things worse. Look, the way I see it is that intelligence is distributed evenly across the globe. The United States has had
even sitting in D.C.
Well, maybe there's some exceptions, but anyway. So intelligence is and talent is spread evenly across the globe. The United States has had preeminence in the life sciences because it has been the best place in the world to come if you're a scientist wanting to do basic research, if you're an entrepreneur wanting to start a biotech company, and we're losing that for a variety of reasons. We're making it an unattractive place for immigrants to come. They're not welcome here. They don't feel welcome here. We give people a PhD and then we kick them in the butt and tell them to go back where they came from, when what we should be doing is stapling a green card to their PhD. And at the same time, of course, you've got the rise of Chinese life sciences, which is remarkable. It's a remarkable story of the last 20 years. Albert Bourla at an event recently said that 75% of the cancer INDs that FDA okayed last year were from Chinese companies.
3/4.
And that means 6 years from now, a very high percentage of the cancer drugs approved in the United States are going to be Chinese.
For a lot of the people who don't know what an IND is, this is what you file with the FDA when you're going to start doing clinical research. It's right when you're kicking it off. So it's announcing to FDA, hi, we're going to start a phase 1. We're registering for clinical research. Here's our application.
Yeah, first in human trials.
Right. And so the patent clock starts ticking, boom, right at that point. That's when your market exclusivity data starts ticking over. That's when you start your loss of exclusivity essentially starts at that point right there. So that's when things get real, as it were. It's fascinating that in some respects, this relationship with China in the U.S. is somewhat analogous to what the U.S. was 40 years ago with Europe. Because if you look at 1980, and we look at 20-year blocks, 1980, 60% of global pharmaceuticals and innovation were produced in Europe. We get to the year 2000, the EU does a centralized procedure. The member states can no longer authorize their own drugs, or they can, but it's preferred to go through the EMA. The U.S. in 2004 puts in a Medicare Part D prescription drug benefit for this specific purpose to accelerate translation from U.S. research to actual reimbursement for the Medicare age population. Now the U.S. is 60, 70% of global innovation today, right now, but as we're putting up these huge barriers to entry, as we're attacking capital investment, as we're going into IRA, which we're certainly going to talk about, I'm sure. And
as of the last couple of weeks, as we're effectively destroying the FDA, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say destroying it, but we're certainly creating an enormous amount of regulatory risk that didn't exist in the past. So your point is that U.S. preeminence in the life sciences, U.S. preeminence in the biopharmaceutical industry is not inevitable, and it isn't inevitable that it will happen forever, and there is a serious chance that the United States will lose it, and once it's been lost, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get it back again.
The Bio Conference a couple years ago, the French sent 45 or 50 people as part of their delegation. And I'm not going to say with whom, but there was a confidential meeting with a very high-level representative at Bio. And the French asked, how do we get it back? How do we get our biotech back? And the answer was, well, stop killing it. Stop making it impossible to create biotech in France. And it's a little scary that, let me phrase it this way. Do you think there's an understanding that these industry leads that we've now carved out in biopharma is not an inevitability, that there are actually consequences to things like the IRA, things like tariffs?
I think that there's a growing awareness that American preeminence in the life sciences is not an inevitability, but I'm not sure that the attribution for the causes of the potential loss of competitiveness in the United States are accurately appreciated. And I think it's far too easy and facile to blame, for example, China, to blame nefarious actors and to say that that there was something malevolent that happened that's taking American preeminence in biotechnology away from the United States, when in fact, as we're going to talk about, I think a lot of the problems are self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah.
In the United States, I don't see how anybody can blame China or any other country for investing in biotechnology, for bringing the best people that they can, their attention and focus on developing the biopharmaceutical industry and trying to advance that for their own people and as a global commercial enterprise. What the United States needs to do is to run a lot faster. First, we need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot, cutting our arms and legs off, whatever kind of analogies you want to use. And then we need to think, well, what can we do to turbocharge innovation in the United States?
Picking up on that, part of the shooting ourselves in the foot and clubbing ourselves, we're chopping off a leg and then beating ourselves in the head with our own leg, I guess. If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, okay? Now, the Biden administration and Congress were adamant when this was passed that there would be virtually no impact on drug discovery due to the IRA. CBO, Congressional Budget Office, agreed with them. 2 years on, what do you think? What do you think of that assessment?
Well, you know more about it than I do.
All right, leading question of the morning. Fine.
This isn't really a fair question for you to be asking me. I should be asking you that, but because you've got the receipts. But here's the way that I look at it. To say that reducing the period of exclusivity for small molecule drugs to 9 years, which is essentially what the IRA did, and at the same time making the exclusivity period for large molecules 13 years, and then thinking that that's not going to have any impact on drug development, suggests that you don't really understand how drug development works.
Yeah.
The way that I see it is, it's like these are great big boulders that have been placed into a river, and of course the water is going to continue flowing down the river, but it's going to flow in a different place because you've got those boulders there. So the predictable thing that will happen if you create a 9-year threshold for small molecule drugs and a 13-year threshold for large molecule drugs is for the drugs that are susceptible to so-called negotiation or price setting under the IRA, companies are going to prefer, all things being equal, to large molecule drugs. That's an enormous problem for a lot of reasons, okay? For one thing, there are conditions that really aren't susceptible to small molecule drug development. For another thing, small molecules are a lot more expensive. Large molecules are a lot more expensive than small molecules. Small molecules inevitably become generics, and the price goes down tremendously. Basically, the cost of production plus a few percentage.
Yeah.
Biologics, more than 50% of the biologics that are nearing the end of exclusivity, there's no biosimilar in the pipeline for them. And even if there is a biosimilar developed, it doesn't bring prices down anywhere near what happens with small molecules. And then if you look at it from the point of view of a patient, who wouldn't rather take a pill than have to go to to a hospital or to an infusion center and get an infusion or get an injection? The whole thing is skewed. If you were going to create an incentive and say, well, which would you prefer, small molecules or large molecules? The proper answer is to say you want whatever is going to be best for solving the problem that you're trying to solve, right? But if all things are equal, then of course you want the small molecule. You don't want the large molecule. I think that this was an entirely unintended feature of the IRA. I think you can trace it back to the debate about the creation of the biosimilars pathway, and at that time there were arguments on Capitol Hill from the biotech industry that biologics were far more complex than small molecules. The patent IP issues around biologics were different than they were around small molecules, and therefore they needed a longer period of exclusivity. And somehow that thinking got translated into the design of the IRA, and it doesn't make any sense.
Well, it was also hardwired into the Affordable Care Act as well, the ACA. So these differentials between exclusivity and market access are sort of already in that. And so you open up one, you got to open up the other. To me, it was always, the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially sticking a Mickey Mouse ear on a balloon to Hatch-Waxman. It's sort of, it seems like we're trying to solve an IP issue around a pricing legislation in Medicare. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
So I think if you take a step back and you say, well, why did Congress do this? I think in part, there's some blame has to be put on the shoulders of the biopharmaceutical industry, because there's a sense in Congress that companies were violating what I call the social contract.
Mm-hmm.
And basically social contract under Hatch-Waxman is you get exclusivity for a set period of time, and then when that's over, your drug gets generic competition or biosimilar competition. The biopharma industry was playing a lot of different kind of games to try to extend their exclusivity beyond the period when it should have been. If anybody who argues to the contrary, I've just got one word for them. It's Humira.
Yeah.
That's and so there was that, and then there was also, I know the fact that there were attempts to come up with a bargain with legislation that would enforce the social contract and that would force companies basically to stop extending exclusivity past the period of time that it was intended in the Hatch-Waxman Act. And the industry decided that they didn't want to have any part of that. And they resisted coming to any kind of a deal with Congress. Senators Grassley and Wyden proposed legislation that, in retrospect, compared to the IRA, would have been a tea party for the industry. But the industry fought it and said, no, we don't want this. This is the nose under the tent, and we're not going to do it. And what happens? You get the IRA.
Let me just make a couple points here about patent length. And there's been a lot of, and you're right, there is an extension that goes beyond what people, I think, assumed in Hatch-Waxman. But if you look, you've got three essentially very successful biologics now that are biosimilar. And it's not just Humira, but Humira had 21 years in the market before competition hit. And there were 6 initially, now there are 9 biosimilars for Humira. Now, yes, AbbVie still has 98, 97% market share in Humira, but the price has dropped by more than a third. It's dropped 40%. So now the amount of revenue that AbbVie is making has dropped 40% in 2 years. So, and I think in some respects that says, hey, the biosimilar system, at least, whether it's imperfect or perfect or not needing reform, the fact is when those biosimilars came in, it did what it was supposed to do. It drove down the price. You have the same with rituximab, and you have the same with Herceptin. Now, what's interesting, all 3 of those drugs had about 20 years in the market. About 20 years. Now, is that too much? Is that too little? I don't know, but I do know that it's fairly consistent and that we've substituted judicial review for legislative or administrative action on this. And the judicial review side of this has ended up at around 20 years, fairly consistently, and you can model that. I guess my point is, if 20 years is too much, fine, then make a compromise around that. Europe gets 15 years for everything. You get your 10 years and then you file a supplementary patent certificate, what's called an SPC, and you can get 15 years in the market. Basta, you're done after 15 years. Okay. Again, would that have been a great compromise now as opposed to IRA? Hell yeah. I think people would have jumped on that and kept it down saying, yeah, I'll buy till you're out of paper. You know, but that's not where we're at now.
No, it's not.
But the reality is, is 20 years too much? I don't know if 20 years is too much, but that's the system that as currently stands. It's not like they can go for 50 years or 40 years or 28 years. It's been 20, 21 years. Now, what we're doing, if you take something like Keytruda, which is hugely successful, and 34 indications now, probably the most successful cancer drug, effective cancer drug ever. We're going to curtail that now at 13 years. So they're losing 7 years on sales that they would have had, that they assumed and did all their calculations on. Is that fair? Well, I think given the system we have, That seems like they're penalizing success, which I have a problem with. That doesn't seem right.
Well, and the other thing that you could argue is that you're pushing Merck and you're pushing all of their competitors to come up with better drugs, even better drugs,
of course,
than Keytruda. So there isn't a magic number. There you can say, is it 13 years? Is it 15 years? Is it 20 years? I think that's really not the point. But I think that a lot of people would say 9 years isn't the right number.
Yeah.
For small molecules. The question is, can it be changed? And what will the industry have to do in order to get it changed? They're going to have to give something up. There's going to have to be something that they're going to have to do to offset the increased cost to the taxpayers of increasing that 9 years to whatever it's going to end up at.
But what increasingly you see, the trade-off is, well, I can still get my 20 years if I don't produce a drug for Medicare. That's the problem. And so you'll probably start even seeing that in biologics. As of right now, in our research, and full disclosure, as Steve alluded, we have a paper coming out that I'm here in D.C. this week to present in a meeting in Congress. The reality is we don't see a shift in biologic investing by exposure to Medicare, but we do in small molecules, 100%. We see basically as you crank up exposure in small molecules, you get less small molecules to a Medicare. It's just as the indications are a higher and higher exposure, dementia is basically gutted, filleted in small molecules. It's basically disappeared in small molecules because nobody wants that exposure. How do you fix that?
It's difficult. The industry is pushing legislation, the EPIC Act.
EPIC Act? What do you think about the EPIC Act?
I don't think that the EPIC Act is going to pass.
Is it going to get thrown into reconciliation?
No.
I don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I know that that's what the industry wants to have happen. A bunch of CEOs went to see President Trump last month, and that was the top of their agenda. They said, please put the EPIC Act in reconciliation. And he said, no, I don't think it can happen. The Republicans have a razor-thin majority in the House. They don't have a very robust majority in the Senate. It doesn't take much to basically to stop something from being inserted into reconciliation. You need near unanimity, and I don't think that they have the near unanimity that they're going to need to get the EPIC Act, which extends the threshold, the IRA negotiation threshold, from 9 years to 13 years for small molecule drugs.
Everything basically it's 13 years at that point.
I don't think that they have the near unanimity that they would need in order to get that into reconciliation. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm hearing.
So what happens then to these politicians who aren't willing to put EPIC into reconciliation when it starts becoming public that legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to force seniors, people with Medicare, people of the Medicare age, to no longer be able to get new medicines to treat dementia, to treat cancer? What's going to be the blowback there? I would think that people are going to feel like they got a bait and switch because this was sold to them. Hey, we're going to save you money in Medicare. And in fact, what it means is you're going to save money because you're not going to get any new drugs in Medicare.
Well, so there's two things there, okay? One of them is that you really can't underestimate the antipathy of the American people and of politicians to the biopharmaceutical industry. So I don't think it's going to be, I don't think that there's any politician in America thinks that it's a winning strategy to go out and say, look, folks, I did something great for the biotech and the pharmaceutical industries. I wish that were the case, but it certainly isn't, okay? And the other thing is that it's very difficult to convince people that something that could have happened didn't happen because of a public policy, because of a law. You believe that. I believe that. You've got the receipts to demonstrate that it's the case. But you can go all across the whole public policy spectrum, not just in the life sciences, and show areas where politicians and the public are unmoved by the threat that something good didn't happen because there was a barrier that was put in the way. So that's a very difficult argument to make.
I know it's a difficult argument to make, but the reality is, if people are going to start seeing, hey, wait a minute, there's these new drugs that are coming in China. There's these new drugs that are coming from Singapore, which will start happening. I think people are going to start, much like the Europeans now are complaining, well, hey, wait a minute, why are we paying for all these American companies? We don't have an indigenous sector anymore. I think the problem is you don't realize it until it's gone.
Well, that's the point. There's a very long lag. By the time it becomes completely obvious, in a sense, it's
too late.
It's too late, or it would take an enormous amount to catch up. But there's always there's going to be a lag, right? The research that you've done, that others have done, looking at reduction in clinical trial starts for small molecule drugs for chronic conditions that affect the elderly, investment in those kinds of drugs and things like that. That's the beginning of a cycle that at a minimum is going to take, 5-6 years to become extremely obvious, right?
Yeah.
And again, then if you wait until it becomes obvious and you say, okay, we're going to put some kind of policies in effect to undo the damage, then you have to wait another
5 to 6 years
to see the benefits of it. And of course, whatever companies or countries have taken advantage of the fact that we've created this gap aren't going to be standing still for that 5 or 6 years. They're going to be running forward.
Do you see that there's a growing awareness of that problem? I mean, are people starting to connect those dots that, hey, wait a minute, maybe we've gone too far here? Obviously not publicly because of the political blowback, but I mean, you're privy to a lot of these conversations. You're one of the sharp knives in the drawer in this town, Steve. Are they confiding, we need to do something here?
No,
not at all.
No, I don't. When I talk to lobbyists, when I talk to members of Congress, when I talk to congressional staff, this isn't the top 5, 10 issues that they're concerned about at all. I think that the reports that are coming out about China getting ahead of the United States in biomedical innovation will cause that conversation to shift to some extent. But I don't think that it's going to shift in the way that you're thinking it will.
Well, how do you think it's going to shift?
I think that, so if you look at the issues around China, there are two ways to think about it. One way to think about it, and I think it's a correct way to think about it, is what can the United States do to run faster? What can the United States do to outcompete China? And that's the way that most of the people who are really savvy about life sciences, pharmaceuticals, that's the way people think about it. The other way to think about it is the way that the national security establishment tends to think about it, which is how can we throw sand in the gears, in their gears? How can we slow them down? What we need to do is to inhibit China. I think that that's a unrealistic goal. I don't think it's something that we can do. I don't think it's something that we should do. But I think that the more urgent the cries become, people reach for that easier to understand option, and they think, well, we can. What we need to do is to erect higher barriers to U.S. investment in China or collaboration with Chinese companies or something like that. So I think that's the kind of like the natural tendency where people go, and that's a problem.
So that's just going to be, well, we'll use these tariffs, we'll just crank them up another 50% on biotech coming out of China.
I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but I think that's where people naturally, that's where they go, and I think that making the argument and saying, well, that the reason that the United States is losing its edge or has the potential for losing its edge is because we've done things like put a 9-year threshold on exclusivity for small molecule drugs that are sold to the Medicare population is a pretty nuanced and detailed argument,
right?
That the public and members of Congress are not likely to understand.
It doesn't fit on a bumper sticker.
No, no, it doesn't.
When I got here, we were first joking around when we started this podcast. We were alluding to all the cuts and things that had happened at FDA and NIH, et cetera. One of the things, me being more of a free market libertarian Hayek type, as it were, hunted to near extinction in this town. But the reality is, if you looked at a lot of the evolution of NIH grants over the last decade, they had gone from a lot of grants to hard sciences, and there was an increasing percentage of those grants that were going to more social, dare I say, social engineering type projects. That was becoming a larger and larger portfolio of NIH grants and government grants in general. Do you think that there's some potential benefit of, whether or not we agree with the size of the cuts, but just trying to refocus and retool what Jay Bhattacharya is probably going to do, which is really retool NIH to go into hardcore, really retool that focus, much like the Hughes Foundation, to go right into good, solid research again?
Look, anybody who looks at what NIH has invested in and the way NIH has operated over the last decade could come up with ideas for improving it. There's no doubt about that. There isn't any evidence that I've seen that the changes that they're making, that the cuts that they're making, are the result of a deliberative process to think about how to improve American competitiveness, to how to improve American science, how to get more science for the buck that we're spending. The cuts have been arbitrary, ill-conceived, and in some instances, I think, malevolent. I literally, my phone, my wife says, can you just turn that thing off at night, because I'm getting I'm getting signal calls, chats from senior people at NIH all day and all night saying, you can't believe it. This person got riffed. This contract got cut. We don't have access to reagents anymore. We can't travel. We can't publish. Hundreds of people were cut at NCI, the National Cancer Institute. People have been cut at all the institutes across NIH in a very arbitrary fashion, and they're afraid that there are going to be even bigger cuts coming. It's really hard to exaggerate the scale of anxiety at NIH among scientists, from senior scientists to entry-level scientists, and it's not focused on, yes, you can cherry pick through, you can go through the grants and you can say, well, this one, I personally think this one was silly, or they shouldn't have been focusing on that. That's certainly true. And they certainly, I believe, could do a much, much better job, and should do a much better job of funding translational research, of going from scientific discovery to something that industry can pick up and turn into medicine, right? But that's not what's happening. And then if you layer on top of that the attacks on the Ivy League universities, again, you can say, well, they're legitimate, or maybe they're legitimate, maybe not. You can argue about whether the concerns that the Trump administration and NIH has had with the Ivy League schools are legitimate, but the response to it has been to hold science hostage,
right?
And to cut clinical trials midway. I mean, what does that say to patients when they find out that their access to a clinical trial that they believed was potentially going to save their lives, or certainly is going to transform their lives and contribute to scientific knowledge, that's been cut because of a political concern about something that their university has done that's completely unconnected to them or to science? So yeah, I agree with you that you can certainly come up with ways that NIH could and should be improved dramatically. At the same time, the foundation of American biomedicine and of the biotech industry and of the pharmaceutical industry has been basic research that's been funded by NIH and research that's been done on the NIH campus. And, we could talk for another hour about things that have happened that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been generous American funding of basic biomedical research. And that's all being put at risk now, and it's not being done in a thoughtful way.
One of my favorite examples is the CAR T therapeutics, because it came out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. It was then brought to the National Cancer Institute with NIH funding. That then basically, there were two hubs that spun out, UPenn and the Hutch Institute in Washington State, basically led to Novartis's CAR T portfolio and Kite's CAR T portfolio, which then became Gilead's CAR T portfolio. Then that also spun out to Celgene, which then became BMS's CAR T portfolio.
And if you look at it, a lot of that can be traced back to one person at NCI, Steve Rosenberg, who's quite remarkable. He pounded away at this for more than a decade. For many of those years, he was considered a crank. The idea that that there were the possibility of having immune therapies for cancer was considered ridiculous, was ridiculed by many in the cancer community. But it turned out that he was right. It's very difficult to have imagined something like that happening in the absence of public investment in science. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have made sense. What kind of company, what board of directors would say, okay, we're going to invest in this. We have no idea whether it's going to work. It may take a decade
or 2 decades in the case of CAR T.
Yeah, exactly, 2 decades. And we're just at the beginning of CAR Ts, right?
Exactly.
So that's a prime example of the kind of public good that an institution like NIH can do, and that's what's under threat from the ill-conceived cuts that are being made now.
And policy impacts productivity and innovation. I know it sounds crazy to even have to say that, but if you look at all the blowback right now on mRNA was initially designed as a cancer treatment, and it makes so much sense as a anti-cancer vector. It makes so much sense. But then ham-fisted policies around COVID that were jammed through have caused an enormous philosophical blowback around the entire platform. And any of us who were looking at adverse event ratios and saying, hey, there's no statistical reason to force vaccination on children unless they have leukemia, we were poo-pooed away and called, nuts and crazy. And now you're seeing part of the problem, part of the reason why you have an IRA, part of the reason why you have these things, these huge cuts at the NIH, are blowback because of ham-fisted, stupid policies during COVID. Is there some recognition of that, or are people still digging in their heels?
I think that certainly concerns over what happened during COVID are what's driving Jay Bhattacharya. He talks about that quite a lot.
And the Martin Kulldorff report, which seems to be something of a blueprint for how Jay wants to restructure the NIH.
The anti-vax movement didn't start with COVID. It started earlier, but that certainly accelerated it. Look, you have to, let's just call it like it is. A lot of the most energetic proponent of anti-vaccine policies and of policies that have led to rejection or skepticism about technologies like mRNA, or our current HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think that you can relitigate. You can go back and relitigate everything that happened right and everything that happened wrong during COVID. The question is, how do we go forward?
Right.
And I think that we have a problem going forward when the HHS Secretary is the person who created a lot of these problems and is adamant about pursuing pseudoscientific approaches to medicine that are really antithetical to the development of new technologies like mRNA.
Have you read the Cleveland preprint on the flu vax from last year?
No.
53,000 people were vaccinated through the Cleveland Clinic. Practitioners, people who are working in the sector. And there's a negative 29% efficacy ratio for people who were vaccinated last year with the flu vax, according to the preprint. Now, in fact, they had a close to 30% higher infection rate post-vaccination. I do think that now this is a preprint that's currently out, okay? I do think investigating some things post-COVID make a lot of sense. I do think. My concern is that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with a technology platform like mRNA. There are companies right now that have very advanced, really exciting science looking at mRNA as a cancer platform, and they're saying, we don't even think we can pursue it. This is the problem. And I think that bad policy makes bad law, unfortunately. And it also creates bad science. And I think that's what we're seeing now is there's enough question about how things were handled, not to relitigate it, but the problem is there's more and more evidence now that's coming out as people never looked at a lot of these things before. And now we're like, wait a minute, that's not right. And My I'm hopeful that common sense returns. My concern is that that's not the way we're going.
I don't see any evidence of a return to common sense. Certainly not. Look, maybe I spend too much time in Washington, but that's not. There's not a whole lot of common sense flying around here these days.
What do you think has to happen for that to occur? Is it going to have? Is it inevitability that it's going to swing too far, and then somewhere we're going to get a compromise here?
No, that's not inevitable.
No, you think it just keeps going off the rails?
I don't know. I think that. I think here's what I do think is inevitable. There's going to be some kind of a crisis involving public health in the United States. I don't know what it's going to be. Could it be a pandemic? Could it be contamination like we had with heparin some years ago? But I don't think that you can think of a 3 or 4 year period when there hasn't been some kind of crisis that's faced the FDA, NIH, the public health community. The question is going to be, what's the response to that crisis going to be? And there's basically two ways that you can go. One way is to basically say, we have to confront it head on. We have to use science, rationality, and good public policy. The other way is to go the complete opposite direction, and to retreat into pseudoscience and conspiracy theories and places where we really don't want to go. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think that it's almost certain that there's going to be some kind of public health crisis that's going to affect the United States in the coming years, and that will lead to some kind of a reset, whether it's in the direction that you're saying going back into the direction of emphasizing science and public health and common sense, or whether it sends the United States reeling into the other direction. I don't think anybody can predict with confidence.
Do we become Mars attacks at some level?
Yeah.
You come at this from a very interesting perspective because you have a geopolitical understanding that's not necessarily shared by people who work in the healthcare sector. I mean, you're a noted expert on Cold War and espionage, which I find fascinating.
So do I.
How do you balance that? Because you're well published in that space. How do you balance the desires to work in healthcare? Do you see them as interconnected?
I try not to, but they do overlap. I actually find researching and writing about Cold War espionage a kind of an escape from my day job, from thinking
sort
about
of happy enough lifting, Steve.
But inevitably there are overlaps. Of course, there are overlaps when you're thinking about bioterrorism. There are overlaps when you're thinking about national security issues associated with the pharmaceutical and the biotech industries. But generally, I try to keep them as separate worlds.
What do you think is going to happen by the midterm elections? Where do you think we end up in 2 years from now?
If we're talking about narrowly, we're talking about the biopharmaceutical industry and legislation, I would say that I think I would hope that we would have seen restoration of the pediatric priority review vouchers. Yeah. I've written that that's as close to a perfect public policy as you can get. It creates powerful incentives for developing medicines for some of the most vulnerable people in the world, children with ultra rare diseases. It costs the taxpayers nothing. It's essentially a transfer from big pharma to little biotech to develop drugs for children who have rare diseases. So I would hope that we would see that restored. I think that we're likely to see an extension of the tax cuts. I think we're likely to see a restoration of immediate expensing of R&D costs. The tax bill that was passed in the end of 2017 changed immediate expensing to a 5-year expensing, and that's something that it's kind of obscure, but it's something that's important to the pharmaceutical industry. So I think we're likely to see those kinds of things happen. Will we see a change in the IRA, the kind of what we talked about earlier, of mitigating the pill penalty? It's not very helpful. to say it, but I think it's about a 50-50 chance that we see that. We may see...
Well, I have to say, those are pretty good odds. It's better odds than I've heard a lot of people in town. I'll take a 50-50 bet on that right now.
I think that there's also a possibility that we'll see a change in the single orphan exemption to the IRA price negotiation program. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah.
So those are kind of like narrow, specific things that I think that are going to happen. My concerns are around the bigger things, right? What's going to happen at FDA legislatively? There, we're talking about what happens with user fee reauthorization. What's going to happen with budgets and structure for NIH?
Well, there's going to be a HIPAA renewal coming up too here.
There's no end of issues that are going to be of concern where there's an intersection between public policy and legislation. It's difficult to predict where these things are going to go. Is there going to be a reaction in so one of the things that's interesting, the first Trump administration, he proposed cuts to biomedical research in all of his budgets. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, rejected those cuts and, in fact, increased funding for biomedical research. Is that going to happen now?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Probably not.
So I think it's safe to say that we're going to see a shrinking of the biomedical research establishment in the United States over the next 2 years. So there's some other areas that are kind of like outside the box that we've alluded to that I haven't talked about, but I think are important. And one is immigration.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, the strength of the U.S. Pharmaceutical industry, the strength of U.S. science is based on the U.S. being the most attractive place in the world to do science and to create companies. If we have immigration policies that change that, then we're in deep trouble.
I mean, Trump during his campaign had said that if you graduate with a PhD in science, STEM, you should immediately come with a green card, as you said. I fully endorse that policy. I don't think anybody with half a brain could fight that and say that that's not a good idea. It's a great idea. Hopefully common sense around that occurs. You mentioned something else which I find is really interesting, and that's the orphan drug exemption issue around IRA. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. Maybe you must be, but there's something of a black hat, white hat problem right now in orphan drugs around the legislation issue, because essentially the genetic-based orphan indications, which are primarily pediatric or younger, don't want to discuss the sort of oncology orphan drug pathways, which actually made up 80% of the accelerated approvals. So you have this great schism, sort of, like Constantinople and the Venetian army in the Third Crusade. No one wants to discuss the impact of IRA on orphan oncology in those clinical trials, which are being really disincentivized to the tune of about $2 billion, $3 billion an asset. That's going to be a big problem, because there was recently a report that I read, I can't remember where it came from specifically, but it basically said, 90%, 95% of all orphan drugs are not going to be impacted by IRA. It's fine. And this was funded by a trade group that had a lot of orphan drug companies. And I'm thinking, well, whoa, time out.
So one of the things that I think is maybe is evidence of what you're saying is a growing interest in creating new regulatory pathways for ultra-rare diseases.
Yeah.
Which, for the most part, are outside of oncology. They're different from what you're talking about. That's a regulatory pathway. In terms of the IRA, what the industry wants, what a lot of patient groups want, is simply to say that drugs that only have orphan indications should be exempt from the Medicare drug price negotiation program. I think it's unlikely that Congress will go there for some of the reasons that you've said, because a lot of the drugs that are developed for cancer that are orphan indications are highly successful drugs, and there isn't really an appetite in Congress to do something that's seen to be a giveaway to industry. I think that there will be a way to thread the needle and to expand the aperture on the orphan drug exemption in ways that will at least mitigate the unintended effects.
If you had a magic wand right now, okay, that you could, or a magic 8-ball or whatever, and you could make one change right now on all the chaos that's going on in town, what would be the one thing that you would recommend right now to say, okay, this is what we need to do first to fix things? What would be, in your mind, the one thing we could do with the quickest win that would be the deepest impact?
Get a new HHS secretary. Really, because if you have somebody who's the HHS secretary who wakes up every morning and thinks, what can I do to improve the health of the American people by applying the best of American science, medicine, and public health to the problem, then everything can flow from that. I find it difficult to see how things can advance along the lines of the things that we're talking about. Remember, CMS, that administers the Inflation Reduction Act, the Medicare Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug provisions, NIH, FDA, they all fall under the Department of Health and Human Services, not to mention the CDC.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of things I think that need to be changed. But if you say, okay, there's just one thing, that's the thing I think would be the most effective.
Well, thank you, Steve. Really great having a chance to talk to you.
Thanks a lot.
The producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Duane Schulthess. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.